Everybody. So, good afternoon. How are you all doing today? Awesome. So, I'm Xander Miller. I'm the digital strategy librarian of Kenosha Public Library. I also buy books here. So, some of the books you may have checked out, I may have bought. So, um, thanks for being here. I know it's a 2 p.m. on a Friday, but I was kind of like, oh, no, it's a good time. Let's talk about banned books. So, of course, we've titled the program Caution Banned Books Be Here, and you are surrounded by books that have been challenged or banned in some way, shape, or form throughout time here. So all of these books, for one reason or another, have been challenged, challenged and potentially removed from libraries or from school libraries and such. So you're all surrounded by those, but we are here to kind of talk about a bit of a history of book bans. We're actually going to talk about what is a book ban. We're going to define that for the program and just getting an understanding of what we're talking about. And for the history, I thought going over illegal history would be the most appropriate. So the American Library Association does keep track of book challenges and bans, but what I was really curious about is like, what challenges and bans were successful or not successful? So I went through and we're gonna go over some of the really key historical legal cases um, and talk about those and explain what, what happened in those cases, what is the text of those cases. And then we're going to talk about libraries and things like intellectual freedom and censorship and what those things are, what they mean to us in libraries. And also, we're going to talk about how challenges actually happen in a library setting in general before we get to the fun part and talk about specific, what books have been banned throughout the decades and can make some guesses on what ones have been. But to start us off, we need to talk about what are book bans. So I like using a dictionary. So I actually went and found kind of broke this apart. So a ban would be a legal or formal prohibition. Part of why I wanted to look at a legal history. And it also means to censure or condemnation, especially through social pressure. So there are kind of two parts through that. Some form of censure and also social pressure is being used to do so. So this is actually a really funny question because in library school, it's one of the first questions we are asked in library school is what is a book? So I've pulled some definitions from Merriam-Webster's dictionary, and funnily enough, there are multiple definitions of what actually is a book. So I've pulled two that are the most relevant for librarians. The first is kind of the physical form. A book is a set of written, printed, or blank sheets bound together between a front and a back cover. So all of these here, definitely books. Library full of books. And then the second is a more philosophical definition. It is something that yields knowledge or understanding. So the joke that we get with talking about what is a book in library school is that a book with these definitions could almost be like that second definition could literally be anything because so many different things yield some form of knowledge or understanding. DNA is a book. Your brain is a book. This is a really long-running joke that we really have to have a philosophical discussion on it, but we can think of books as ideas or carriers of some form of information. That's where that first definition comes from. So something that yields knowledge in that form could be defined as thinking about a book. So when we talk about a book ban, we're going to kind of combine these definitions. So for what we're using today, we'll talk about the legal, formal, or social prohibition of the knowledge or understanding contained within a book, and this part is a bit added on, and I'll explain why, as a means to restrict or remove access to information. So that added part, there's that bit of added bit is because book bans tend to have a targeted purpose that makes them different from something that's like a standard book removal. Um, Libraries, librarians, teachers remove books from libraries constantly. It's just a standard process. However, they're not book bans in that sense. A teacher could change a curriculum and exchange one book read for another. That's not a book ban. Book may be old and musty and full of water damage and we remove it, but that's not a book ban. Book bans need to have an underlying purpose to them to restrict or remove access to some sort of available information. That's the key component here, is that there's restriction or removal to the information. Not even, so information as a whole, so not necessarily a book. It could be like a DVD, for example, but we're gonna kind of get into that as we get to the next part, because we're gonna talk about kind of banned books in history. Again, this is a legal history. So book bans and censoring of information, they aren't new. As long as history has existed, there's always been an attempt to control information. And for this part, I'm only going to be talking about banned books, banned materials in the United States, rather than throughout all the world's history. Just our scope is a bit lower. The United States is the most relevant for us, and particularly because the United States has the First Amendment of our Constitution, which reads, "Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people to people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for redress of grievances." You're gonna hear me correct myself a lot because when I'm reading legal things, I'm trying to be as exact as I possibly can. Because as a note, I'm not a lawyer. So I'm not gonna be interpreting the legal cases or saying it's illegal to do that or it's illegal to do that. I'm going to be reading what some of the judges' opinions are. Expert legal scholars have talked about for their summaries or the results of cases. And even doing so is going to kind of form a story of what's happened when books have been banned or challenged within the United States. So are we all on the same page of what I'm going to be going? All right, let's go. And like I said, we'll be talking about books and other forms of media. Okay, so legal cases relevant to banned books. There's quite a few, but the first one we're actually going to talk about is Evans v. Selma Union High School District of Fresno County in 1924. So in this case, the California Supreme Court permitted a high school to purchase 12 copies of the King James Bible for its library. The court decided that the purchase did not offend state constitutional provisions prohibiting discrimination or preference in religious professions or prohibiting any state appropriation for sectarian purposes. The court pointed out that the school was purchasing the Bibles for reference rather than devotional exercises. So it's kind of interesting that we start with a case about the Bible as one that was trying to be restricted, but as noted here, the key point, the court pointing out that the school's purchasing the Bibles for reference rather than devotional exercise is part of what looks like in how the law was written, at least, or how that case went. The next I'm going to mention here is Alberts v. California in 1957. We're going to return to part of this one a lot. In this case, is written that the Constitution does not protect obscene materials. That, like I said, that's going to return multiple times throughout many legal cases. And this case, just for clarity on why they came to that decision, this case was in reference to a mail order business out of Los Angeles that was advertising what was considered lewd or obscene materials through the mail. And someone, someone went to court over it, and the court ruled that the Constitution doesn't protect obscene materials. So keep that in mind. We're going to talk about obscenity later as well. So the next two are quite close to each other, so we're going to kind of talk about both of them here. So Butler v. Michigan, this was also in 1957. This held that a Michigan law violated the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment. The law had made it illegal to sell printed material thought to be obscene because its potentially harmful influence on youths. Specifically, Justice Felix Frankfurter found it disturbing that in trying to protect children, the Michigan law limited grown men and women from accessing material that may be appropriate for them. While in Smith v. California, Justice William J. Brenna Jr. asserted that the California law had placed unconstitutional limitations on public access to material protected by the First Amendment. This was in reference to selling a book that was at first seen to be obscene, but particularly the same justice chose not to express an opinion on whether the book in question was actually obscene. And if you're curious, the book was the pulp fiction novel Sweeter Than Life by Mark Tryon. If I may have butchered that last name, but that was in sale of a book and attempts for obscenity. So, as I said, obscenity is going to come up a lot, and particularly this one is actually still relevant today, very relevant today. And this is the case that established the Miller test for obscenity. In Miller v. California, Chief Justice Warren E. Burger established a three-part test for juries in obscenity cases. Whether the average person applying contemporary community standards would find that the work taken as a whole appeals to the prurient interest, whether the work depicts or describes in a patently offensive way sexual conduct specifically defined by the applicable state law, and whether the work taken as a whole lacks serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific value. That was the latest case that has defined obscenity. As far as I'm aware from the research I've had, there hasn't been another case that has redefined obscenity from the research that I've seen or found. There hasn't been another case that tried to redefine it. The thing in this case that we're talking about, though, is that Marvin Miller had been prosecuted for mailing advertisements for 4 books regarding sex and pornography. In this case, he was actually convicted under a California law prohibiting the distribution of obscenity. And while the Supreme Court affirmed that conviction, that test was established for them to actually define what obscenity is. So that, in that case, and again, obscenity is going to come up even more in these cases. We actually have more. Like I said, there's quite a few cases through the 20th century on trying to ban or remove books or materials or just in general from the public eye in the legal sphere. The first thing we're talking about is, and forgive me for the names, is Erznosnik versus City of Jacksonville, 422 U.S. 295 in 1975. The conclusion of this case, and then we'll talk about it after the conclusion is that the Supreme Court held that under the First Amendment, the government may not censor expression simply because it offends some people. So in this case, the City of Jacksonville officials said that an ordinance that provided that prohibited drive-in films from showing films that contained nudity or protected the privacy rights of sorry, let me repeat that. Said that an ordinance that prohibited drive-in films from showing films that contained nudity protected the privacy rights of unwilling viewers and protect minors from harmful material. But in the majority opinion, Justice Lewis F. Powell wrote that when the government acting as a censor undertakes selectively to shield the public from some kinds of speech on the ground that they are more offensive than others, the First Amendment strictly limits its power. So we've come up with the First Amendment again. It's come up a few times now about the government in particular restricting different kinds of speech. So we're actually going to go into a school district for this next one. This is let me see that, it's Menarson versus Strongsville City School District in the Sixth Circuit Court. This is in 1976. The Strongsville School Board was sued for removing books from library shelves. One of the books was actually Catch-22 by Joseph Heller, little known book. And then there were two Kurt Vonnegut books, God Bless You, Mr. Rosewater, and Cat's Cradle, where all three were removed. And in this decision, the federal court decision in this case reaffirmed the principle that school board officials do not have unfettered discretion to remove books from library shelves simply because they find the books objectionable. The appeals court in this case said, we are concerned with the right of students to receive information which they and their teachers desire them to have, and that it clearly raised First Amendment concerns. So this is one of the cases that is actually in a library, though a school library, talking about access and rights to information that's set out to the students. In 1982's New York v. Ferber, however, it was held by the Supreme Court that the First Amendment does not protect child pornography. It was further reasoned that such material was not protected even if it's not obscene because of its links to the sexual abuse of children. Even so, despite a 9-0 case in this one, the core essence was not agreed upon by the Supreme Court justices, as written in various formal opinions. There are all sorts of opinions. I'm not going to be able to quote all of their opinions here because there's a wide range of what their thoughts were. But they do range from questioning if this applied to clinical pictures of adolescent sexuality or to pictures in a National Geographic magazines to a serious work of art that may be entitled to constitutional protection. And from viewing that, it was basically they didn't agree on the core essence of what actually makes up that kind of pornography. However, they all agree that it's not protected by the First Amendment. So there's agreement there. And so before I talk about the next case, there's something I want to talk about that's relevant for public libraries or any public government space, really. And that is what a limited public forum is. So according to the Cornell Institute, a limited public forum is a type of a designated public forum. Here, the government limits access to a designated public forum to certain classes or types of speech. In good news, the Supreme Court held that in a limited forum, the government may discriminate against classes of speakers or types of speech. However, the government is still prohibited from engaging in viewpoint discrimination. For example, the government may limit access to public school meeting rooms by only allowing speakers conducting school-related activities. It may not, however, exclude speakers from a religious group simply because they intend to express religious views. So that definition is key for what we're going to talk about next. And that comes up the next legal case. And this is kind of the big one for public libraries and libraries everywhere. This is Sun v. City of Wichita Falls in Texas, 121F, supplemental 2D 530, Indy, Texas, and this is in 2000, the year 2000. There are two books in question here. It's Heather Has Two Mommies, which we actually have available here, and Daddy's Roommate, which we actually don't have in our library, so I wasn't able to grab that for you. So these books, they're both children's books about kids with gay and lesbian parents. In 1998, individuals and some groups and other groups attempted to challenge the book through the library, many of whom objected to the perceived messages of Heather and Daddy, of one moment, Heather Has Two Mommies and Daddy's Roommate on religious grounds. They felt as if they were waging a moral battle against the books. The library didn't, after review, did not remove those books. So those groups and individuals next went to the city council, which when it came to a vote, they voted for something called the Altman Resolution, which restricted access to those books. The Altman Resolution allowed for any 300 private citizens who wished to remove a book from the children's section of the library to sign a petition in order to have it moved to the adult section. Shortly after the city had voted on that, and 300 names did come through in a petition, and those books were moved, a lawsuit was filed about that. And so the next portions are going to be talking about the conclusion that came from that legal case. So here's a quotes from that legal case as we go. The Wichita Falls Public Library, like all other public libraries, is a limited public forum for the purposes of First Amendment analysis. In a limited public forum, the government's ability to restrict patrons' First Amendment rights is extremely narrow. Thus, the city cannot limit access to library materials solely on the basis of the content of those materials, unless the city can demonstrate that the restriction is necessary to achieve a compelling government interest, and there are no less restrictive alternatives for achieving that interest. In regards specifically to the Altman Resolution, the court said this: on its face, as applied to the defendant's removal of Heather Has Two Mommies and Daddy's Roommate from the children's area of the library, violates plaintiff's constitutional right to receive information. It is undisputed that the loss of First Amendment freedoms, even for minimal periods of time, constitute irreparable injury. The books were then kept in the children's section of the library afterwards. So that actually ends the legal portion of the case and me reading a lot of slides and words. So that is, it's very interesting how throughout the 20th century, there's a kind of a slow rolling development of what is allowed and isn't allowed under the First Amendment. There is one other legal case that I wanted to include that was actually super recent in Virginia. However, I was not able to find documents on it, so I did not include it. This included the publishing of books in Virginia that where one of them was genderqueer and another A Court of Blood and Fury, I believe, and that they were being challenged for obscenity, which the judge threw out. And that actually completely changed Virginia law. However, I was not able to find more supporting evidence or documents, so I did not include it in the presentation, just because I didn't see written official opinions or documents on it. But that, what I just said, was the result of it. The judge did throw that case out, and that did change some of Virginia's laws. The American Library Association does have more information on different court cases. I will be happy to share that link with you all if you would like it. But next, we're going to be talking about libraries intellectual freedom and censorship. And now we're going to be very specific to libraries and what libraries try to do. The first thing we get to talk about is intellectual freedom. So according to the American Library Association, intellectual freedom is the right of every individual to both seek and receive information from all points of view without restriction. It provides for free access to all expressions of ideas through which any and all sides of a question, cause, or movement may be explored. This is one of the kind of core tenets of librarianship and libraries in general, is this idea of intellectual freedom and providing free access to expressions and ideas without restrictions. Now, when we talk about censorship, censorship is the suppression of ideas and information that certain persons, individuals, groups, or government officials find objectionable or dangerous. This includes changes in access status of material such as exclusion, restriction, removal, or age and grade level restrictions. So, as we defined at the beginning of the presentation, that a book ban is a means to restrict information. Book banning is censorship. Because in order to ban a book, got ahead of myself. Book banning is censorship because we're talking about books as a conveyor of information. And censorship is plain the suppression of ideas and information. So book banning is now a method of censorship, which is where the idea that there needs to be a purpose to that book, that removal of the book ban, to remove access to information. So that's kind of all fitting together in that sense. So in order to ban a book, though, a book has to be challenged first. And so we're going to talk a little bit about what a challenge is. A book challenge is an attempt to remove or restrict materials based upon the objections of a person or group. Note that this is an attempt. It hasn't been removed yet. Most libraries have a step-by-step process for book challenges, and this is followed to give a proper care and attention to a challenge. And what I'm going to have for you is generally the steps on how that goes in libraries. Like I said, most libraries do have some way to challenge books. However, different libraries do it differently or may have different settings than what's on here. So the first thing that libraries have folks do is fill out a request for consideration as the formal first step of challenging a book. These can have a variety of questions in them. They can have different things you have to do. So a lot of libraries will, have a checkbox of "Did you read the book?" as one of those things in the request for consideration. There can be a lot of steps, a few steps. It really depends on the library. But after a request for reconsideration comes in, a reconsideration committee is formed. This group of people will review the book as a whole, and this group could be made of community members, administration, librarians, teachers, parents, board members, or other groups of folks. So it really could be quite a diverse group that is doing it. It could be a small group, it could be a big group. One of the things that the American Library Association recommends is that it has to be an odd numbered so that when they vote, there's a decision that is made. So this group reads the book in its entirety, as well as reviews the library's mission, policies, professional guidelines, and other tools for evaluation in order to come to their conclusion. This group then also makes a recommendation to retain the book, relocate to another location, or remove it. So that's part of this, discussing this material in order to get that done. So, and like I said, it's reporting to a governing body. It's not this group makes the final decision. So another governing body is going to make the decision. The final decision could be a board, could be a director, could be whatever is whatever governance over this decision is there. They're reporting to them their recommendation. And then the results are communicated to the individual who made the challenge, and the action, whatever that result happens at that point. Um, most libraries have an appeals process if they are looking for more information on why, or want to kind of re-challenge it. But usually that is how that goes. For the sake of today's, I've actually printed out our libraries, what our request for reconsideration form is, and we also re-updated our collection policy that it's part of. That actually got updated at our last board meeting. So if you're interested, you can feel free to take those and review them at your leisure. It's quite a long read, so there's only one copy because it's huge. I can print another one for you. It is online. So it's online on our website. So one of the founding principles that this committee uses to judge the decisions they make is called the freedom to read. And this is one of those really big principles for libraries and librarians. In 1953, the American Library Association, an organization established to develop, promote, and improve library and information services to the whole profession, developed this freedom to read. There are 7 points to this freedom. They say it's in the public interest for publishers and librarians to make available the widest diversity of views and expressions, including those that are unorthodox, unpopular, or considered dangerous by the majority. So this covers all sorts of viewpoints, discussion points, whether it's whether one group think it's terrible or one group thinks it's amazing. It's that we're making it available as the goal. The second is that publishers, librarians, and booksellers do not need to endorse every idea or presentation they make available. It would conflict with the public interest for them to establish their own political, moral, or aesthetic views as a standard for determining what should be published or circulated. Essentially, I'm not going to stop a book that I don't like from getting into the library. That's kind of the purpose of this point. The third is that it's contrary to the public interest for publishers or librarians to bar access to writings on the basis of the personal history or political affiliations of the author. We're actually going to talk about that with one of the banned books we're going to talk about a little later, because that is actually a big reason why it was banned. The fourth is that there's no place in our society for efforts to coerce the taste of others, to confine adults to the reading matter seemed suitable for adolescents, or to inhibit the efforts of writers to achieve artistic expression. So no one's confined to any sort of circle of reading. Everyone can read whatever they'd like. I really like this children's book. I have the freedom to read that. It is not in the public interest to force a reader to accept the prejudgment of a label characterizing any expression or its author as subversive or dangerous. Again, dangerous writing isn't something to be censored. It is the responsibility of publishers and librarians as guardians of the people's freedom to read to contest encroachments upon that freedom by individuals or groups seeking to impose their own standards or taste upon the community at large, and by the government whenever it seeks to reduce or deny public access to public information. So when looking at that, it's not just a community setting a standard, it's also if there is a government trying to set a standard of reading to oppose that as well. So which is interesting, especially considering public libraries are technically part of government. So there's just the freedom from anybody to restrict both the government itself as well as other groups, as in this statement. And the seventh and last point is that it is the responsibility of publishers and librarians to give full meaning to the freedom to read by providing books that enrich the quality and diversity of thought and expression. By the exercise of this affirmative responsibility, they can demonstrate that the answer to a bad book is a good one. The answer to a bad idea is a good one. So this freedom to read is really one of those, again, founding areas of libraries, of librarianship, even publishing and publishers, that everyone can read whatever they are desire and have access to whatever they would desire, with the limitations of there's only so much money for so many books, and space. We can't have every book, but we're going to get as many books as we actually can, so everyone can actually have something to read. That said, book challenge tracking. So unfortunately, book challenges, there wasn't tracking forever for book challenges. The American Library Association has been keeping track since 1990 of challenges to a book. And as I mentioned, a challenge is an attempt to remove or restrict materials. So these aren't necessarily all been banned or removed from a library, but they have been challenged. Um, so with that, I've included some of the highest challenged books for the past 3 decades. So let's take a few guesses on what's there. And the first one is for 1990 to 1999. Any guesses on what the most challenged or banned book was for this decade? Okay, the guess was To Kill a Mockingbird. Any other guesses? Going once, going twice. The most challenged was actually Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark by, and oh my gosh, I can't even read the who it's by on here, but Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. What was that? Alan Schwartz. So this was due to violence, disturbing imagery, unsuitability to children, and a myriad of other reasons. So also in this decade, that is actually To Kill a Mockingbird is in the top 100 for this decade. Also though are things like The Giver, which I was required to read in 7th grade, which is pretty funny to me. Flowers for Algernon, which I was required to read in 8th grade, and multiple Stephen King books. And even Where's Waldo by Martin Hanford. That one is really interesting. So I had to actually look up why in the world did it show up in the top 100. So there aren't any words in Where's Waldo. If you don't know, it's finding this like guy dressed in like red and white stripes amongst a huge image. However, on one page, at about the size of 1/16th of an inch, in the 1987 edition, there is a beach Where's Waldo, where a woman has a bare chest for 1/16th of an inch because a boy next to her played a prank on her or something. It was very silly. Um, and this is the suspected reason that the book has been banned or challenged. So the funny thing is that the 1990 edition of that had that same image. That same woman was covered. So it was made aware that that was why it was challenged. So how about the 2000s? Any guesses on the most banned or challenged book? Okay. That's okay. That's okay. Any other guesses? What did we read a lot in 2000? Um, how about I give you a hint for this one? Have any of you received a letter to Hogwarts? So the Harry Potter series was the most challenged or banned book of the 2000s. And the big reason was actually due to religious reasons and witchcraft. And that one, Harry Potter has been in these lists for a long time. Like almost every year, Harry Potter gets challenged in some way, shape, or form, which is it's interesting. Because it's also been a big deal with movies and blockbuster deals and such and so forth. And it's actually kind of gotten a bump recently because of its author. So it's been reoccurring for completely different reasons on why it's been challenged over the years. And that's a thing that makes a lot of these. There's a lot of repeats in these top 100s for the decade because people are still challenging the same books for the same reasons, but each time. So all three books that I mentioned for last decade appear in this decade's top 100 as well. Other really interesting ones, Of Mice and Men is in the top 100 for 2000 to 2009, which I had to read in 11th grade. So yeah, a lot of these are very used. And so the reason was for the use of racial slurs, profanity, vulgarity, and offensive language for Of Mice and Men. Funny enough, the Captain Underpants series by Dave Pilkey is also on there as one of the top 100 books. And that was due to violent imagery. If you've never read Captain Underpants, they have these kind of flip open little action sequences where there's a cartoon characters like punching a monster or something. And so violent imagery and images being one of the reasons things could get challenged. That's why that one of the reasons that one has been challenged. And another book, and I actually didn't know of this book before I was researching for this event, is A Prayer for Owen Meany. It's a book heavy with themes on friendship, religion, and spirituality. And it's been banned or challenged due to its vulgar language and has been described as pornographic at times. So it's interesting, but really there's a wide range to folks trying to challenge or get books banned in a big area. So how about the 2010s? Any guesses on this decade? So has been in the top 100. It was in the top. It's actually in this decade. It's actually returned to the top 100. It's not the number one though. It did return from the 90s to this year, which it's an old book at this point. So that's really interesting to me that it's returned. However, you did already say which one was the most banned for this decade, but for last decade. So, The Absolutely True Diary of a Part-Time Indian was the most challenged book of the 2010s. This one was also for a variety of reasons, because it seemed to upset everybody. It's been banned or challenged because of acknowledging poverty, alcoholism, and sexuality, and sexual misconduct allegations against the author, profanity, cultural insensitivity, depictions of bullying, racism, sex education, violence, drug references, unsuitability for age groups, and a myriad of other reasons. This book upset everybody, essentially. Everyone's mad at this book for whichever reasons, but it's a book that's available to read. Also in this decade are things like 50 Shades of Grey, um, for sexual references and more. A book called The Adventures of Super Diaper Baby, for the purpose of it had a little bit of potty humor, and that's a quote, potty humor for that one. The Holy Bible made it back to top 100 this year, um, for and for religious viewpoint. Um, and as I mentioned earlier, Heather Has Two Mommies shows up once again. So there's a ton of reasons to challenge a book, or a ton of reasons people do challenge books, I should say. And they're freely available here for you to read. So that's why we say, caution, the banned books are here. They're all around you in the room, and any of them are available for you to check out.